Good evening, everybody. Have another Why Do We question for you here this week. I'm going to begin by telling a story about my confirmation class. Way back when my family had just moved to Belmont, Wisconsin, and Dad started serving churches. This was his first church as a lead pastor. And so went through confirmation with my dad. So here's a little bit of the story, though. Sometimes confirmation classes can be a bit of a snooze. I've heard some horror stories from some folks from along my travels. There are many different factors, like the effectiveness of the teacher, the curriculum, or even the willingness of the student. But mine was a fairly interesting and actually interesting time, and had some very memorable moments. One was that, as I just mentioned, my dad was my pastor, and this was my dad's first year as a pastor, and that was pretty special for me. Another interesting fact was that I was the only guy in a class of 6 or 7, and that was just fine by me being a new kid in town. I had to memorize the books of the Bible, but Pastor Dad made that fun. Also, this was one of the first times where I began to understand the intersection of the Christian faith with real life. Again, good job, Pastor Dad. And so I liked my class. Everybody got along in it. Dad was a good teacher, made it fun, and we certainly learned about our Christian faith and what it is that we believe in, how we live out that faith. Or she began learning about it anyways. Now, part of this confirmation journey was visiting a couple of churches to see what they did and talk about some of the differences and similarities between our church and their church. In Belmont, we had 3 churches in town. We had the United Methodist Church, Lutheran Church, and we had Catholic Church. And so we went to the Lutheran Church down the street for an in-person visit during one of their worship services. And I don't think it was a Sunday morning. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a Sunday morning, so I'm pretty sure I think it was during Lent. It was a midweek service during Lent. And now, while at the Lutheran Church, we took communion as a part of the time of worship. One difference was that they used wafers instead of bread. We always had somebody come in and cut bread, like we do here when the Bartrams come in, and there are communion stewards, and they make sure everything's set up for us. And so I wasn't ready for the wafer, and I was surprised by the lack of taste in the wafer. And this wafer would not dissolve, couldn't chew it, and it was actually sticking to my tongue. I couldn't shake it free. So I thought I'd wait for the grape juice that would help me be able to swallow the wafer. Nope. They did not use grape juice. They used wine. As if I already wasn't struggling with a piece of styrofoam, I was now surprised with the first taste I had ever had of wine. I choked and gagged and coughed some more. I had to excuse myself, fly down the side aisle until I got outside, where I spit most of what was left in my mouth out into the bushes. Yeah, leave it to the pastor's kid to have the best or worst reaction. The pastor of the Lutheran Church at least had a sense of humor about it, and she never let me forget that time where I took communion in her church. Pastor Dad didn't tell us that the Lutheran Church used wine and not grape juice like the good old Methodists. And in a small town, most folks had been to one of the 3 churches, or to all 3 of the churches at some point, and I'd guess the other parents knew what would await us. But Dad thought he'd have a little fun and not tell us that wine was being served. Well, this leads us to our Why Do We question for the week. Why do United Methodists use grape juice instead of wine for communion? Well, we need to go back to the early part of the 19th century to learn about why the switch was made. You see, drinking had become a problem in America in the early 1800s. In the 1820s, this problem was exacerbated by the invention of the column still, which could produce more hard liquor and do it faster than the previous methods. It was everywhere. It was cheaper. This wasn't unlike the gin mills ruining families and neighborhoods in England during John Wesley's day, and John Wesley trying to figure out how to combat the alcoholism that was running rampant in his own country. Different movements began across the country to combat the problem of alcoholism and all that stemmed from it, mainly abuse and violence. Groups formed in the 1810s to deal with the problem locally. President Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War took away the soldiers' daily alcohol ration and forbade the serving of alcohol at military events. In the 1840s, the Washington Group formed in Maryland, which is a predecessor of Alcoholics Anonymous. A young Abraham Lincoln is on record as giving a temperance speech in 1842. Maine, in 1851, the state of Maine was the first state to go dry. 5 more states, territories joined Maine the next year, and by 1855, 7 more on top of that, and 7 more states and 1 territory joined the No Alcohol Allowed Club. Now, this didn't last too long as the focus of the country began to center on abolishing slavery, and then the Civil War occurred. So a lot of the temperance movement and the momentum it had died down. But after the Civil War, the temperance movement picked up again. One of the main driving forces in this movement was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Founded in 1873, it became the largest social reform group in America. It was during this time that many churches began to find an option other than wine to serve during communion, as a lot of the churches, too, were at the forefront of the temperance movement. The thought behind this was that the church shouldn't tempt those who struggle with alcohol problems, and the denominations that were the predecessors to the United Methodist Church, along with other non-Methodist denominations, thought this as an important witness to the grace of God and of the church's resistance to the abuse of alcoholic beverages. So what now? Enter Dr. Thomas B. Welch. He was a dentist. Before he was a dentist, though, he was a longtime member of the Wesleyan Methodist Church and was an ordained pastor in that denomination. Again, a predecessor to what would eventually come the United Methodist Church. Voice issues forced him to leave pastoral ministry. He then went into dentistry. He moved from New York State up north in New York State out to Minnesota and then back to New Jersey where his sister lived. So he and his family then ended up in Vineland, New Jersey, and there he found himself to be a communion steward of the local Methodist Episcopal Church. And he wanted to make sure that there was no alcohol in his church. He was a staunch supporter of the temperance movement, and he didn't want to risk serving alcohol to anybody. So Dr. Welch wondered if Louis Pasteur's breakthrough process of preventing bacterial growth in milk and wine, known as pasteurization, would work with grape juice. Pasteur had this process patented in 1865. By 1869, Dr. Welch had perfected the pasteurization process of grape juice. Before this, grape juice would ferment and turn into wine. Pastor Gordon Pettibone, United Methodist pastor, wrote about some other options that other folks tried in order to keep the grape juice from fermenting before Dr. Welch came along. Here's what Pastor Pettibone says. He says, one solution was to squeeze grapes during the week and serve the juice before it fermented. But grapes were not readily available to serve in all congregations. Some creative communion stewards chose to make their own unfermented sacramental wine, and one recipe called for adding a pound of hand-squashed raisin pulp, otherwise known as dried grapes, to a quart of boiling water, and later in the process, the quote-unquote winemaker was to add an egg white. Sounds appetizing, doesn't it? Well, these processes, they could be frustrating. As was mentioned, grapes weren't always readily available, and especially that last one sounded a little disgusting. So Dr. Welch produced what he called Dr. Welch's unfermented wine, so that his church and then others could be sure of an alcohol-free communion. It was his son, Dr. Charles Welch, who was an enterprising Methodist layman and a dentist like his father, who then marketed the pasteurized grape juice to a temperance-minded evangelical Protestants as authentic biblical wine. As word spread and as the temperance movement grew among evangelical Protestant churches, Welch left dentistry and produced Welch's grape juice commercially. Methodists were smack in the middle of the temperance movement of the 19th and then the early 20th centuries. A Methodist invented pasteurized grape juice, so of course, United Methodist folks have used grape juice since the late 19th century for communion. Now you know the answer to why we use grape juice instead of wine at communion, and why I gagged at communion at that Lutheran church in my town all those years ago. Folks, have a good rest of your day, and hope to see everybody on Sunday morning for worship at 9 a.m. Also a reminder that next Tuesday, September 1st, we'll be meeting in the parking lot from 7 to 9 a.m. You don't have to stay for the whole time, but we're going to come gathered for a specific time of prayer for the beginning of all the school years, and all that's before the administrations, the faculties, the staff, the students, the parents, and all that's involved. And so 7 to 9 a.m., feel free to come in. There's going to be individually wrapped baked goods. If you come, bring your own coffee, and we'll just have really a simple time of prayer. All right, folks, you guys take care, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.